Everything has to be paid for. A single cruise missile costs between $1.5 million and $3.5 million. It flies for roughly 20 minutes. It destroys a transformer station that took 3 years and $200 million to build. The math is not complicated. It is, however, devastating. Energy infrastructure is the single most cost-efficient target in modern warfare, not because it wins battles, but because it systematically dismantles the economic foundation everything else depends on. This episode examines how targeting energy systems functions as a form of economic warfare, why the asymmetry between destruction costs and reconstruction costs is so extreme, and what happens to an entire economy when the lights go out permanently. This is not about power grids, this is about power itself. The asymmetry that makes it work. The fundamental economics of energy warfare rest on one calculation: the cost ratio between destroying infrastructure and rebuilding it. For most military targets, this ratio is relatively balanced. A tank costs $4 million to build and roughly the same to replace. A fighter jet, $80 million to $100 million in production, comparable to replace. Energy infrastructure breaks this pattern entirely. According to World Bank assessments of post-conflict reconstruction in Ukraine, the cost to rebuild a major electrical substation runs between $150 million and $300 million, depending on capacity and transformer specifications. The munitions required to render that same substation non-functional, a concentrated strike of cruise missiles or aerial bombs, cost the attacker between $10 million and $40 million. The destruction-to-reconstruction ratio sits at approximately 5:1 to 15:1, depending on the target and the weapon system used. This ratio is why energy infrastructure becomes the preferred target almost immediately in any conflict where one side holds air superiority or long-range strike capability. It is not strategy in the conventional military sense, it is economics. They said targeted strikes on energy infrastructure would create temporary disruptions. They got cascading system failures, weeks-long blackouts affecting millions, and reconstruction timelines measured in years. The cascade effect: one target, 1,000 consequences. A single power plant does not exist in isolation. It feeds into a transmission grid, which feeds regional distribution networks, which power hospitals, water treatment facilities, manufacturing plants, heating systems, and communications infrastructure. When you destroy a critical node, a major generation facility, or a high-capacity transmission hub, the failure does not stay contained. SIPRI and the International Energy Agency have documented this pattern across multiple conflicts. In Syria, systematic strikes on energy infrastructure between 2012 and 2016 reduced the country's electricity generation capacity by approximately 80%. The initial targets were generation plants, but the economic consequences extended far beyond energy production. According to UNCTAD estimates, Syria's GDP contracted by roughly 60% during this period. Not 60% of that decline is attributable to energy disruption alone, but energy infrastructure destruction was identified as the single largest contributing factor, the mechanism through which military action translated into economic collapse. The cascade works in several layers. First, direct production loss. Every hour of blackout in an industrial economy represents lost output. The IMF estimates that for middle-income countries, each hour of nationwide electricity disruption costs between 0.3% and 0.5% of daily GDP. For Ukraine, with a pre-war GDP of approximately $275 billion annually, that translates to roughly $225 million to $375 million per day of full nationwide blackout. Second, equipment damage. Industrial machinery, medical equipment, and data systems degrade or fail when power is interrupted repeatedly. This damage is not recoverable through restoration of electricity. It requires replacement. Third, population displacement. When heating, water treatment, and communications collapse simultaneously, populations move. Displacement carries its own enormous costs. borne by both the origin and receiving countries. The heating crisis, winter as a weapon. Energy warfare reaches its most brutal economic expression in cold climates during winter months. Heating infrastructure, centralized heating plants, gas distribution networks, and thermal regulation systems represents a specific and extreme vulnerability. In Ukraine, centralized district heating systems serve approximately 30 million people. These systems depend on gas-fired or combined heat and power plants connected to citywide pipe networks. The cost of maintaining heating for one Ukrainian city of 1 million residents runs approximately $200 million to $300 million per winter season under normal conditions. When generation capacity is destroyed, backup heating, portable units, diesel generators, decentralized alternatives cost 3 to 5 times more per unit of thermal output delivered. The World Bank's 2023 assessment estimated that Ukraine's energy sector sustained cumulative damage exceeding $10 billion between late 2022 and mid-2023 alone. Reconstruction of heating and electricity infrastructure was identified as the single largest cost category in national recovery planning, larger than housing, larger than transportation, larger than any other sector. They said, winter strikes on energy networks would pressure the population psychologically. They got a humanitarian crisis measured in billions of dollars, a reconstruction bill that will take a decade to clear, and a civilian infrastructure deficit that no battlefield victory can undo. The reconstruction trap. Here is where energy warfare becomes self-perpetuating as an economic mechanism. Reconstruction of energy infrastructure is not a one-time event, it is a cycle. Rebuilding a destroyed power grid takes time, typically 12 to 36 months for major components, depending on supply chain access and security conditions. Transformer manufacturing is concentrated in a small number of countries. High-voltage transformers, the most critical components, have production lead times of 12 to 18 months under normal conditions. Under wartime demand and supply chain disruption, these lead times can extend to 24 months or longer. This means that any energy infrastructure rebuilt during an active conflict remains vulnerable to immediate redestruction. The attacker faces no meaningful cost increase for targeting repaired systems. The defender, however, bears the full reconstruction cost again, plus the cost of whatever temporary backup systems were deployed in the interim. According to RAND Corporation analysis of protracted conflicts, infrastructure that is destroyed and rebuilt multiple times generates cumulative costs 3 to 4 times higher than a single destruction reconstruction cycle. This creates what economists call a ratchet effect. Each cycle of destruction and partial reconstruction leaves the system weaker, more expensive to maintain, and more dependent on external aid. The economy does not return to its pre-conflict baseline. It settles at a lower equilibrium each time. The shadow economy that emerges. When centralized energy systems collapse, they are not simply replaced by nothing. They are replaced by informal, inefficient, and often exploitative alternatives. Black market fuel distribution, illegal diesel generators, and gray market electricity emerge within weeks of prolonged infrastructure failure. The IMF has documented this pattern in multiple post-conflict contexts. In Yemen, energy system collapse between 2015 and 2020 generated a shadow fuel economy estimated at $1.5 billion to $2.5 billion annually, entirely outside formal taxation and regulation. In Libya, fuel subsidies that once cost the state $3 billion per year were redirected through informal networks after infrastructure destruction, creating economic channels that proved extraordinarily difficult to dismantle even after physical systems were partially restored. These shadow economies do not disappear when the lights come back on. They persist because they serve actors with financial incentives to maintain them. The economic damage is not just the cost of destroyed infrastructure, it is the permanent structural distortion of the economy that follows. The agricultural and industrial collapse. Energy infrastructure does not only power cities, it powers agriculture. Irrigation systems, grain storage facilities, food processing plants, and cold chain logistics all depend on reliable electricity. When energy systems collapse, food production follows, not immediately, but within 1 to 2 growing seasons. The Food and Agriculture Organization documented this pattern extensively in Yemen. Between 2015 and 2020, energy infrastructure targeting disrupted irrigation across Yemen's agricultural regions, contributing to a food production decline of approximately 30%. The cost of replacing destroyed energy systems in agricultural zones was estimated at $800 million to $1.2 billion, but the economic value of the lost agricultural output over the same period exceeded $3 billion when measured against pre-conflict baselines. Industrial production collapses even faster. Manufacturing requires consistent, high-capacity power supply. A single day of blackout in a factory producing steel, cement, or chemicals does not simply pause output. It damages equipment, spoils raw materials in process, and requires recalibration before production can resume. The World Bank estimates that for manufacturing-heavy economies, each week of sustained power disruption reduces industrial output by 15% to 25% cumulatively, with recovery taking weeks beyond the restoration of power itself. The long account. Energy infrastructure destruction is not a battlefield event. It is an economic event with a timeline measured in years and costs measured in tens of billions. According to the World Bank's Ukraine Recovery Conference assessments, total energy sector damage and reconstruction needs exceed $35 billion as of 2024. This figure does not include the indirect costs, lost industrial output, displaced populations, backup system expenditures, or the shadow economy distortions that will persist long after physical systems are restored. For comparison, the entire annual GDP of several European nations falls below this single-sector damage figure. The cost of one country's energy infrastructure destruction in one conflict exceeds the GDP of many countries that have never seen a single missile strike. They said energy strikes are a tactical tool with measurable bounded costs. They got a generational economic liability that will outlast the conflict itself by decades. The missile costs $3 million. The transformer it destroys costs $200 million to build. The economy that transformer sustained generated billions annually. The reconstruction will take years. The shadow systems that replace it will persist longer. And the next strike, the next cycle, resets the clock entirely. This is not warfare as destruction. This is warfare as economic surgery, precise, cheap, and permanent in its consequences. Everything has to be paid for, but not everything costs the same to destroy as it does to build. Energy infrastructure is where that asymmetry lives, and it is where modern conflicts are truly won and lost, not on battlefields, but on balance sheets. Subscribe to The Price of Conflict, because the real cost of war is never the one being reported.